Tuesday, February 4th, 2025. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, President of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you to all of our listeners and viewers throughout the world. The Washington Brief is affiliated with the Washington Times, and therefore the Washington Times covers our program regularly, which helps us to really communicate with all the different areas of the world. We're very honored to present our panelists today. Our regular panelist is Dr. Alexander Manzarov. Dr. Manzarov is adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University. He's also the adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And he is a quite amazing person that has great insights, especially in Northeast Asia. And our moderator is Ambassador Joseph Detrani. Ambassador Detrani has a distinguished career in many aspects of intelligence and security. Formerly, he was Special Envoy of the Six-Party Talks with North Korea, and Director of National Counter-Proliferation Center, and Associate Director of National Intelligence. We're honored to present to you today someone who's been very, very helpful to our audience and several of our programs. Dr. Bruce Bechtol, Jr. is an award-winning professor of political science at Angelo State University and a retired Marine. He was formerly on the faculty at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, as well as the Air Command Staff College. Dr. Bechtol has also served as adjunct visiting professor at the Korea University Graduate School of International Studies. He was an intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1997 to 2003, eventually serving as a senior analyst for Northeast Asia in the Intelligence Directorate on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. He's a prolific author of books and peer-reviewed articles on security issues. His most recent book, entitled Rogue Allies, The Strategic Partnership Between Iran and North Korea, will be published in May by the University Press of Kentucky. A widely sought-after expert on North Korea, he's going to be a very, very exciting person to receive insights from today. Dr. Bechtol has been called on to present commentary for CNN, BBC, CBS, Fox News, National Public Radio, and the Washington Times through this Washington Brief. We're honored to present this program to you. Ambassador Detrani, it's going to be a great day.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome to Dr. Bechtol. This will be a great discussion. There's so much going on in the world. Today, however, we will drill down on Iran and Iran's close relationship, and in fact, their command of proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and better understand how Iran is a player in these equations, because the war in Gaza continues. There's a temporary ceasefire, but the war continues. Obviously, the war in Ukraine continues with significant casualties on both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians. So, but today, let's really get into Iran and their proxies and what they're doing to destabilize the Middle East, and how Iran basically, and these are my words, wants to eliminate the state of Israel. Over to you, Dr. Bechtol.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Trani. It's a real pleasure to be here with Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Manzarov, who are old friends. And it's an honor actually to meet Joe Detrani, since I've been reading so much of his stuff for so long, and he's often in the endnotes and bibliographies of my books. So it's quite a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to talk about today, as Dr. Detrani, Ambassador Detrani said, was something that hasn't been talked about a lot. I watched the session you all did, and I watched most of your sessions, the session you did with my good friend Greg Scarlett last week, where you talked about what North Korea has done to assist Russia. And while the SOF stuff is relatively minor, all the arms they're sending is a major player there. But nobody's talking about what North Korea has done in the Middle East. You know, we're seeing EO imagery from the White House and briefings on how many munitions are going and how often and how they're going. And we're hearing nothing about that on the Middle East. So it'll be in my book that'll come out in May, available on Amazon.com, 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 of course. And there was a lot of stuff talking about the potential for this stuff in my last book, which came out in 2018. So I'd like to talk about the stuff that's going to be in my book in May, which is essentially the proxies of Iran, because most of what we saw since October 7 was proxies, and then the two attacks Iran made that we both know about. So let's talk about Syria first. As everybody knows, in Syria, in 1991, they were awarded around $3 billion from the Saudis for sending Syrian troops to fight in the Gulf War, to fight with the Saudis. By the way, as everybody knows, I'm sure all of us are old guys who all remember the United States was offered that money too, and we said, that's okay. But the Syrians came into a great deal of money. What did they do with it? Well, the first thing they went out and did with that was, as related to today, was they went out and they bought Scud Cs, hundreds of them. And the North Koreans got those to them within a year and got the payment within a year. That went so well that the North Koreans actually built Scud D fabrication facilities in Syria for the Syrians, but they were still using North Korean parts, obviously, and North Korean technicians and engineers were at those facilities, and were until very recently, like last month or in December, I should say. Those worked so well that they asked the North Koreans to sell them Scud Ds. The North Koreans did that. Um, and they still were working on those until a few months ago as well. North Korea also sold, as those of you who study North Korea, like Ambassador Detrani, that he'll love this, they sold, built for Syria, a nuclear reactor that looked like somebody had stuck Yongbyon in the middle of the Syrian desert. I guess they thought the Israelis were stupid. Hey, we just put a fake roof over it, they won't know, right? Nice try. But that was destroyed by the Israelis, reportedly, according to according to an Iranian who defected to Germany. And this is in my third book. The Iranians paid the North Koreans $2 billion to do that, which is big money for the North Koreans. The Civil War was a big boon, the Syrian Civil War for for the North Koreans. They sold the Syrians everything. The two key things that they sold them were, of course, chemical weapons, which didn't all get destroyed until last month, by the way, by the IDF. 498 sorties is what was reported. But they also sold them an awful lot more Scud Cs. And by the way, Sasha Mansurov was my source for some of this. It was in my fifth book, available on Amazon.com, Amazon.com. In 2016, reports showed North Korea had supplied Syria with several types of artillery systems, like machine guns, anti-tank guided missiles, refurbished older Soviet-era tanks, mostly T-54, 55. They also supplied the Syrians with the manned portable air defense systems, or MANPADS. Also in 2016, the North Koreans sent two battalions of special forces over there, known as Chalma 1 and Chalma 2. They fought near Aleppo. There's no, again, unlike with Russia, where we're seeing reports every day coming out on what they're doing with Russia and the Ukraine, we have no idea how heavy their casualties were, even if they took any. And hundreds and hundreds of every kind of light weapon that could be had. In 2019, after the war had wound down for good, we thought, obviously, silly us, the North Koreans sent 800 folks over there to refurbish Syrian military facilities and to do some other things, reconstruct missile sites, etc., refurbish chemical facilities. In 2024, as I said, late last fall in December, the Israelis destroyed what they call strategic Syrian sites, knowing that the current government in Syria was much more likely to pull off something crazy than the Assad government had been. They said, "We'll just take all this out," which I think was very prudent. Included in those sites were obviously chemical weapon sites and Scud C and Scud D missile sites supplied to the Syrians by the North Koreans. So let's talk about Hezbollah. The world watched Israel go into Lebanon with ground forces during the last week of September 2024. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is the Israelis had no choice with this. Why did they have to go into Hezbollah with ground forces? Because Hezbollah had taken and put probably most of their stuff into tunnels. A 45-mile long tunnel network that was really a network that spread out and ran all the way up to Beirut. This tunnel network was built by the Korea Mining Development Company. Sound familiar to you, gentlemen?
Yes.
The North Koreans paid COMID, as it's known, $13 million to build it. Building started in 2013. By 2016, they had reportedly already paid the North Koreans $6 million. It was reportedly done by 2021. They were planning on doing, Hezbollah was, what they did in 2006 with the tunnels. And I know you two gentlemen remember that. The Israelis were far less effective than they thought they would be against the ground forces of Hezbollah because of those tunnels. Well, the Israelis were ready for them this time. In fact, the Alma Research Center in Israel, which is basically a think tank outside of Tel Aviv, came up with a report that described those tunnels in detail, including how they got them and who went over to help build them. They contain underground command and control rooms, weapons and supply depots, field clinics, and specified designated shafts used to fire missiles of all types, rockets, surface-to-surface missiles, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, etc. It's important for me to state here, I cannot overstate this, that these tunnels were a key factor, perhaps the key factor, in Israel's decision to bring ground forces into the conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanese territory in 2024. These tunnels, gave Hezbollah not only longer sustainment, but the ability to move forces and equipment from combat zone to combat zone without being seen by IDF aircraft or other intelligence collection methods. So it was key. It's also key for me to throw Syria back in here and talk about the fact that Syria going down, Assad's government going down, had a huge effect on Hezbollah because a lot of those North Korean arms and Iranian arms that were flowing into Hezbollah came down through Syria. So not only did North Korea lose a customer when they lost Syria in December, but they lost a good route for getting stuff into Lebanon. So we're going to have to see how that develops. I know guys like Ambassador Detrani will be watching that closely since he's a counterproliferation expert, and Sasha will too, I'm sure. So that was a big deal. Let's talk about and of course when the Israelis went in, they destroyed thousands and thousands of 122 millimeter rockets, Type 63 machine guns, which is the North Korean equivalent of an SKS, Type 58 rifles, which is the North Korean equivalent of an AK-47, and lots of stuff. They destroyed most of that stuff, and a lot of that came from North Korea, some from Iran too. So let's talk about Hamas, the primary recipient of North Korean proliferation, military proliferation in Gaza and the West Bank. They're the main guys, although they've sold to splinter groups from Hamas, who, as we saw in this recent violence, were working with Hamas anyway. So what did that involve? Well, between 1990 and 2000, Iran donated 20 to 50 million annually to Hamas. Some of that was probably paying for weapons. In 2008, they donated 250 million more to Hamas. But Hamas is not, as you gentlemen know as well as anybody else, is not a Shiite organization. The Alawites are sort of Shiite light, I guess you'd call, but Hamas isn't even. I mean, they're Sunni Muslims. So their relationship with Iran has always been on again, off again. It was off again in 2012. And that was because, rhetorically, the Hamas folks were backing the rebels that were fighting the Assad government, of course, with much more than just rhetoric. Iran was backing Assad's government, the Alawite government. So they basically broke apart between 2012 and 2017. Enter the North Koreans. So in 2014, the North Koreans brokered a deal that I wrote about in 2021 in a national interest article. I know you gentlemen read that. And in that deal in 2014, they sold thousands and thousands of 122 millimeter rockets to Hamas. But perhaps just as importantly, they sold them a lot of multiple rocket launchers. Now, all of us have watched the footage. If you see footage from the early 2000s, even by Hamas and stuff they fired at Israel, usually those one rocket things. If you look at the stuff post October 7, it's very obvious they're using multiple rocket launchers. You can see these whole, they look like birds flying together, when they're going south of the wind. So very interesting stuff. In addition to that, um, in 2018, a gentleman, I speak Korean, not Farsi or Arabic, so please excuse me if I mispronounce this. A gentleman named Fadi al-Bash, a Palestinian Hamas operative, was assassinated in Malaysia. Everybody agrees it was the Israelis. Um, why? Because he was working with the North Koreans on guidance systems for 122 millimeter rocket systems, and then those were being smuggled under the Egyptian border into Hamas. So, what are the capabilities that the North Koreans specifically sold, proliferated to Hamas that were used in October 7th and after? One of them was a obviously, 122 millimeter rockets. They actually found rocket casings right near the border with Gaza that had Bang 122 written on them, BANG, but it was in Hangul. So that's as about as much of a smoking gun as you can have. They also sold the F-7 North Korean made RPG, rocket propelled launcher. We saw actual pictures of that on October 7th with Palestinians carrying it. They also sold them a laser guided anti-tank missile. There are several types. It's called Bullseye, which, as Sasha knows, means firebird. Say means bird, bull means fire. They sold that to them. By the way, there's several versions of the Bullseye. The version that the Palestinians and Hezbollah have is basically carried by a crew. You can carry it around by hand. There's also a much bigger version called the Bullseye 4 that's mounted on a light armored vehicle that they sold to the Russians and that the Russians are using right now in Ukraine. So the North Koreans will sell anything to anybody. At any rate, those are the systems they sold them in addition to a lot of Type 58 guns and Type 73 machine guns. And their tunnels looked remarkably like the tunnels that were in Lebanon, except they were built in softer soil, leading many analysts in Israel and myself to assess that they were probably built with North Korean assistance. How, I don't know. So that's Hamas. So a lot of stuff, AK-47s, Type 60, Type 73 machine guns, rocket propelled grenades, 122 rockets with special guidance systems. The last proxy group is the Houthis. And the Houthis first started using North Korean weapons when they captured some Scud Cs that North Korea sold to the previous government. But, let's say Sasha and I we're Houthi rebels, right? So we find some Scud Cs. We can't just like take our lighters and go, okay, I'm going to light this missile and it'll fly out. No, somebody's got to train those guys how to use them. They need and how to operate the guidance systems and all that. That was the Iranians. That was the Iranians, and the Iranians started then not selling them, giving them their missile that's called the QIAM, QIAM, which is basically nothing more than a souped up Scud C. And then they called it something else, same missile, the Houthis did, and they shot a lot of those. And in 2019, according to the UN panel of experts, they also bought a whole bunch of stuff from North Korea, including ballistic missiles, probably those advanced Scud Cs. To quote Open Democracy and an independent global media association, the weapons for Yemen range from light weapons such as Kalashnikovs through general purpose machine guns, anti-tank missiles, and shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, right up to tanks and ballistic missiles. The transit route has been primarily through a Syrian-registered company headed by a Syrian arms dealer named Hussein al-Ali. Now, making this even more interesting and more of a smoking gun, one of the ballistic missiles shot down, headed for Israel, but shot down over Jordan. And when Americans recovered it, they found it had Hangul markings on the engine cover. So there you go, Hangul, the language of North and South Korea. So that was going on at least for a while, right up until the unpleasantness and on October 7th. Let's talk about Iran itself. We've talked about their proxies. Um, Iran launched two very big attacks, as we all know, ballistic missile and drone attacks that they launched against Israel. One in April, and the next was later, was even bigger. While the attack was quite large, it was also largely ineffective. According to spokespersons for the U.S. and Israeli militaries, 99% of the projectiles launched at Israel failed to make it through Israeli and American missile defense, which worked very effectively, along with support from other allies, including even Jordan. Um, well, what nobody from the White House talked about, what nobody in Congress talked about, nobody has talked about it at all, is the primary missile, ballistic missile that was used in those attacks is called the EMOD, as in Echo Mike Alpha Delta. In Morse code, that would be dit, da, 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 dit. That EMOD, I'll be testing on that later, by the way. That EMOD system is nothing more than a souped up Shahab 3. The Shahab 3 is nothing more than a copycat of the Nodong. So the North Koreans sold the Nodong to the Iranians. The Iranians liked it. They had the North Koreans build a fabrication facility like the Syrians did with Scud C and like the Iranians did with Scud C. Had them build a fabrication facility, but it still needed some North Korean parts and North Korean assistance. As soon as they got that fielded out to Iranian military people, they then started work on an advanced version of that with assistance from the North Koreans. That missile was first tested in 2015, the EMOD, and that was the missile that was fired in both of the large attacks. This means the Iranians carried out their attacks using missiles that could target Israel, largely thanks to assistance from North Korea. There is other stuff, such as the ICBM that North Korea is developing for Iran, which is basically a copy of the Hwasong 15. But I'm going to have to stop there because I'm at my 15 minutes of fame, and I'm open for any questions. And gents, thanks for having me.
Bruce, that was outstanding. Let me just commend you for the that summary and the comprehensiveness of what Iran has been getting from North Korea and what the various proxies are getting. Iran's proxies are getting from North Korea to persist with the war in Gaza, etc. Let me just one anecdote before I turn it over to Alexander. In 2007, as you correctly stated, the Israelis discovered that that North Korea was building, if you will, a nuclear reactor in Al-Kabar. It was a model of what they had at Yongbyon. And they started that in 1997. Now, mind you, in 1997, we had the agreed framework and we were building 2 light water reactors. We were coming in 2000, by 2007, we were coming out of the 6-party talks and so forth. So there was that element of Iran persisting. I should say North Korea persisting. And in this case, persisting with Syria. So when you talk about a serial proliferator, there's no question about it. North Korea indeed has been and continues to be a serial proliferator. Alexander.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Bruce, what an amazing overview of the strategic landscape surrounding Iranian, North Korean dealings, and especially the North Korean assistance to the Iranian proxies. Now, I'll make a couple of points and then ask you a question. 2 general points and then a question. When I think about North Korean-Iranian relationship as a whole, I tend to see it as a kind of cash and carry type of relationship, as a marriage of convenience, if you wish. In my opinion, relations between Pyongyang and Tehran are much more tentative, much more distant, much more whimsical, if you wish, than they're usually portrayed. Even the rhetoric of mutual solidarity and diplomatic support tends to be rather lukewarm and pro forma. Also, the so-called friendship, quote unquote friendship between the 2 countries, in my opinion, is purely transactional, is very opportunistic, and it really lacks any serious relational dimension. I mean, nothing stranger you can imagine than the relationship between ayatollahs, having one faith, and the supreme leader. The name is the same, supreme leader, but the faith of Chuche is very different. Again, every time there is an opening for the Iranian regime to turn to the West, it tends to abandon all its friends from the East and do its best to land in that corner. The same with North Koreans, by the way. Every time they try to normalize relations with Western partners, they tend to forget about the old friends in the East. Now, obviously, both Pyongyang and Tehran, they exploit opportunities with very little regard for consequences, while using each other for selfish gain. I mean, North Koreans, I'm sure you're aware of that, back in the past, shared quite a few nuclear technologies with the Iranians. They invited Iranian scientists to witness the nuclear tests. They shared the nuclear weapon designs with Iranians, etc. At the same time, the 2 countries don't really hesitate to walk away from the political or business transactions between themselves, which they see as harming their interests or inflicting higher costs than they expected. And yes, the mill-to-mill and military technical exchanges, the arms trade between Iran and North Korea, kind of in the 1990s and 2000s was very significant, but the overall relationship, I think, is rather thin and brittle, and there are plenty of barriers to expanding that cooperation. Again, there is a lot of evidence in the open sources about the missile cooperation, and you referred to EMAD project as one, but there are, I'm sure you just didn't have time, I know, to elaborate on a dozen or several dozen other projects, but there is very limited open source information on the cooperation in the nuclear field, other than what I mentioned. Now, another quick point observation from what you said about the North Korean supplies of all these small arms and munitions to Hamas and other players in the Middle East since October 7th, it struck me that we know North Korea is heavily kind of engaged in supplying the Russian ally with artillery, some missiles, and other military products, one regional war. And now you're telling me they're as actively engaged in supplying belligerents in another regional war in the Middle East. So I'm thinking about the North Korean munitions industry. Oh my God, it must be very busy these days that it's actively churning out, I don't know, depleting the warehouses or maybe stepping up on the production gears to supply belligerents in two regional wars. So that's quite an accomplishment by Kim Jong-un, if you wish. But let me ask you a question. And now this is the question. Really, what happened in the past year in the Middle East is that the Iranian axis of resistance has collapsed. Assad is gone, Hamas is demolished, Hezbollah is routed, and the Houthis basically in the dungeon, I mean, fighting for their lives. So Iranians are in much weaker position today than they've ever been since the revolution. And so that begs a question. I mean, how effective really North Korean military assistance has been to all these proxies of Iran? And if it hasn't, or it was kind of impactful only on the margins, why should we bother even? Why should worry about it? So I'm asking the so what question. I mean, yes, they did some help, provided some help, but it didn't really make any difference. Assad is gone, Hamas is destroyed, Hezbollah is out of the picture. So why worry? Other than the nuclear aspect, as Ambassador Detrani suggested with Al-Kibar nuclear reactor, that type of proliferation. So why should we worry about the activities in the Middle East? It's inconsequential, just like, in my opinion, in the Russian theater, in the Russian-Ukrainian theater.
You're asking me why we should worry about that?
Yeah, I mean, so many
I
other
would
countries supply weapons
okay.
to the region.
I
They
would ask
fail.
that
They
same
fail.
question to the Israelis, because they would tell you pretty definitively why we should still worry about that. Um, I, I fear, and again, Ambassador Detrani probably knows more about this than I do, but I really fear that Hamas is, or something called something else that has essentially the same ethos could rise up again in Gaza. The same could happen in Lebanon with Hezbollah if they are not completely destroyed. They're not completely destroyed. They could rise up again. Now, I don't know that that will happen, but certainly preventing those arms from going over there is something that could be, and should be done better. Um, there's nothing special about the weapons either Hamas or Hezbollah had. I mean, the Syrians, yeah, they had chemical weapons, and that was a big deal, and they had ballistic missiles. That's a big deal. Also largely destroyed now by the IDF. Um, but 122 rockets are responsible for a lot of casualties in Israel, and they got a lot of those rockets from North Korea. Same goes for F-7 rockets. They took those. There's actually a picture of guys carrying those F-7 rockets. Remember that rock concert that they basically just invaded? That's where those were filmed. So I mean, those are very effective. SKS effective. The Type 73 machine gun, as you know, the sight for a normal SKS, Sasha knows this because he is a Russian, but the sight for a normal SKS is at the top of where you're firing, right? Well, the North Korean geniuses, when they built it, decided, okay, well, we're going to make this so you can put it on the ground, and the magazine blocks that when you put it on the ground. Oh, so we'll put the magazine on the side, not the magazine, the magazine on top, and the sights on the side. So it's so easy to tell what that machine gun is because nobody else makes an SKS like that except the North Koreans. It's just fascinating stuff. I'm still scratching my head as to why they would do that. But those weapons that they continue to provide, they were very important in the Syrian civil war for the Iranian/Syrian/Hezbollah side. They caused a lot of casualties for Israel. I think if you were to ask an Israeli, and I have, do you think you won this war? Because Americans look at what they did. And, hey, they basically won the war. The Israelis took a lot of casualties. To them, this is not victory. Taking a lot of casualties is what they care the most about. There's not a lot of us Jews in the world. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that's important. And so I think that Israel will be very much focused on Hamas and Hezbollah. The North Korean networks providing whoever replaces those two entities, if they do, and the same goes for Iran. I'm not sure. I think I have to agree with Sasha, at least partially on this, that I'm not sure that our government will focus that much on it. They have not in the past, except for the missiles and the nukes, which are obviously very important strategically. They have not focused on the huge amount of conventional weapons that North Korea has sent over there. And I think it's fascinating. My good friend Tal Inbar, who may be the best missile expert in all of Israel, he got a call after the missile attack, the first one from the Iranians against Israel, because one of those Emad missiles, the souped up Scud, excuse me, the souped up Nodong, actually landed in the Dead Sea. So the Israelis went into the Dead Sea and pulled the missile out so that he could look at it. And he took all kinds of pictures and then he sent them to me. So it looked like a no-dog, you know. It didn't hit anybody. It basically petered out of fuel and landed in the Dead Sea. So the important thing about all of this is the Iranians had all of these missiles from the North Koreans. How many of them actually hit anybody, or hit anyone, damaged infrastructure heavily, or killed anybody? Almost none of them. So I think part of that is is a tribute to both Israeli ballistic missile defense and those Aegis-equipped ships that we had out there in the Gulf. That's a big deal. Not most countries can do that, but the Israelis can and we can. And also part of it is because the North Koreans just don't make very good missiles. They shoot a volley of 100 missiles, 40 of them are going to fall out of the sky. So I hope that answers your question.
Right.
Absolutely.
Can I let me make one comment and then ask a question, Bruce? I see North Korea as a serial proliferator, and the word that Sasha used, transactional, and a lot of that is their illicit activities are to make money, to nurture, if you will, the leadership, to build up their nuclear capabilities, their so-called nuclear deterrent. And so they're doing it for money. And they certainly done it with Iran. And not only are you talking about Scuds, but you're talking about a no-dong. And you mentioned the Hwasong 15, where they're going into an intercontinental ballistic missile. I mean, if I was sitting in Europe, I'd be very concerned about those developments. But they've done it with other countries, whether it's Libya, whether obviously Syria, with Al-Kabar, etc. So the regime in Pyongyang is out there selling their missiles, selling other things. You mentioned chemicals, biological, but also I would say this, when you talk about counterfeiting $100 notes from the United States and cigarettes and anything that's illicit, they're in the business for, to make money. So, Bruce, my question to you is this. Where is the ideological issue with North Korea? Is there an ideological issue that drives them to be a serial proliferator, that encourages them to sell these weapons of mass destruction to proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis? Because these are evil people. and they want the destruction of Israel. It's so obvious. Why is Iran doing it? Why is North Korea doing it? And is it just for the money?
Well, that's a very important question. That's the question. I think the three of us would probably agree on my answer. That money is important because it helps to sustain the regime. I mean, I've seen figures, and obviously the North Koreans aren't showing me their books from Office 39, but I've seen figures that said estimates place 40% of North Korea's real economy is coming from illicit activities, not just military proliferation, but all the other things you were talking about. Although military proliferation is probably the biggest chunk out of that. There's other stuff like, working at camps in Russia and China and in the Middle East in the past, and all kinds of building statues in Africa. But the biggest chunk comes from military proliferation. What is all that for? Like, why would they put 12,000 of their very best troops into Russia? Because Kim Jong Un and his leadership thinks of those troops just like you or I would think of a no-dong missile, or a or a 170 millimeter long range artillery piece. They are simply weapon systems used to gain money for the regime. And so the number one ideology of the regime is to maintain the regime, and this is a key way to do it. And I think that's the reason why it's not going to stop, because they need the money. And that is why also, when President Trump was talking with Kim Jong Un back in 2018, that's why, even though sanctions, a lot of people have kept saying over the years, are not that effective. They're not that effective. Well, if they're not that effective, why were the North Koreans so intent on making President Trump drop them, right? They don't get everything. They may not even get all of it, but they get a chunk, and that hurts the North Koreans. So in the future, we'll have to see. Again, so I think their motivation is maintaining the regime. Get those funds so they can maintain the regime, which is certainly logical. But I think when you talk about what we can do to stop them, it actually is very expensive for us. How do we enforce PSI? Our Navy is smaller than it was after World War I right now. You know, um, uh, are we willing to go after the banks and go after those illicit funds and go? And now, as you'll see in my next book, which is available on amazon.com, coming out in May, um, as you'll see, I had to spend a whole chapter essentially looking at how they have evolved their financial networks, which is key here. That's a big part of the picture when it comes to proliferation, right? And they have started evolving from this intricate, dynamic spider web of front companies and working with triads in China, et cetera, to using cyber to launder their funds. And that has done nothing except make it more difficult for us to go after the funds. Because I think you gentlemen would probably agree that's the most important way to go after North Korea's proliferation, is hit them where the money is. I think that's going to be a real challenge for the United States and the EU and Japan and the ROC, et cetera. Singapore is going after those funds to try and shut that stuff off. And it depends on what our priorities are as far as spending money for agents that are going to be involved in that, and bankers and all that kind of thing, cyber experts. So you asked me what time it was, and I built a watch for you, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that money goes into North Korea now that people are more focused on them, and now that they've got, and that's one, and two, now that they're using cyber better and more effectively than they ever have to launder their funds, and point three, now that China and Russia have their back. So this is going to be a very interesting set of years coming.
Those are just outstanding comments, Bruce. I just feel that all the insight you just provided. Thank you very much. Alexander, over to you.
Okay.
And maybe one more question, and then I'll ask a question and we'll wrap it up. Please,
Okay,
Alexander.
absolutely, Ambassador. Thank you. And the question is simple. I mean, we hear a lot about the new administration, its willingness to engage the North Korean regime in a new round of summit diplomacy. And to put it in the context of the North Korean-Iranian relationship, my question, Bruce, is simple. I mean, Kim Jong-un is well aware of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, nuclear mega deal concluded by Iran and Western powers, Russia and China, which President Trump walked away from a few years ago. So the question is simple. I mean, what lessons do you think Kim Jong-un might have learned from that Iranian experience? And moreover, now the U.S. policy towards Iran is under review, and we expect some big announcements maybe this month, later this month, and it might become much more aggressive. So if this administration really decides to go after the Ayatollahs and apply force together with the Israelis to bring down that regime, then again, what message would it send to Kim Jong-un, as he is invited to negotiate with the Trump administration, which basically discarded the JCPOA and now is contemplating to go after with military force against their former partner at the negotiation table. Any lessons by Kim from all those observations? What do you think?
I don't honestly know what reason Kim would have to deal with us right now. Why would he want to do that? I mean, can you think of a time? Of course, you and I are about the same age. Can you think of a time since the Cold War ended that things have been so advantageous for North Korea geopolitically? I can't. I mean, so if you're Kim Jong Un and you're making $6 billion every 18 months off proliferation to Russia to send them stuff that's basically copies of Russian stuff, um, um, and you're getting support from China, and Russia and China basically shot a torpedo in the UN panel of experts for you at the UN last year. Why would you want to deal with President Trump? What has he got to offer you that you're not already getting from the Russians and the Chinese? The Russians and Chinese are basically protecting them from a lot of the sanctions, and you've got cyber to help out the money laundering that you have to do elsewhere. So I would not. I mean, never say never for Trump. He does some things that I scratch my head and go, wow, that actually worked. So I mean, never say never on him talking to Kim Jong Un and working things out. Didn't go great last time. Really didn't gain a lot of concessions from the North Koreans, unfortunately. I just don't see.
So you're saying Iranian example does not matter. Iranian experience does not really matter for Kim Jong-un here. Is it what you're saying? Iranian failure with JCPOA and Iranian kind of becoming a threat, being threatened again now by its former enemies, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't, come into his calculations.
No, and I would be, I mean, obviously the perception is that the U.S. is advising the Israelis not to attack Iran. I don't see us taking a full-scale attack on Iran. They might use some kinetic methods like the Israelis did, but that was a response to an attack on them. I don't see that as a major thing. What I do see, I'm sure you probably agree, is that sanctions against Iran are going to be pretty tough over the next couple of years at least. They're going to have a tough time. So but Kim Jong Un's already under those sanctions, the kind of sanctions that Iran's probably going to be under. So I just have to ask, what can we offer North Korea, that the Russians and the Chinese are not already giving them? At least in the six-party talks, which Ambassador Detrani was very deeply involved in. At least the Chinese and the Russians tacitly acted like they supported us somewhat. They're not even pretending now. So things do not look good as far as getting North. To me, things don't look good as far as getting North Korea to move toward an era of more peace and prosperity, cooperation with their neighbor to the south, or their willingness to proliferate, as Ambassador Trani said, stuff all over the world. They're a serial proliferator. I don't see any reason why they would stop.
You know, Bruce, no, I like your answer. And you mentioned the six-party talks. And, you know, after 2.5 years, we did have a September 19, 2005 joint statement, which committed North Korea to declare and to halt, if you will, all their nuclear activities and destroy their nuclear weapons in return for security assurances, economic development assistance, and a path to normal relations with the United States. And you're so correct. Russia and China were with us. So we had 5 countries: South Korea, Japan, Russia, China, and we were with the United States. So trying to get Kim Jong, and this time it was Kim Jong-il, to understand this is in their interest, to no longer be a pariah state, so they could be open to international legitimacy, international financial assistance, economic development assistance, and obviously lifting of all those biting sanctions. So Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, was very interested in that. And I believe his father, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, Kim Il-sung, would have been interested also, because this is a path. And normalizing relations with the United States was high on their list, very high on their list. But as you correctly stated a minute ago, it may not be as high on their list any longer, because they have Russia and China behind them. And in fact, they have Iran, and you're looking at the BRICS, and you're looking at the SCO, and you're looking at the global south, and other countries may be looking at different forms of governance, and so forth. However, I'd like to go back to believing that North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States. It will give them that international legitimacy. I don't think aligning themselves with the Russian Federation and with China and Iran will give them that international legitimacy that they need. They will have to continue to be serial proliferators to sustain their form of governance and so forth. And I just, from the 3 summits or the 2 summits with President Donald Trump, I just don't think that was Kim Jong-un's desire to do that. So my question to you is this: why not work harder on China and Russia to come back into the fold, and to say North Korea with nuclear weapons is not of interest to China, it's not of interest to Russia. We're looking at the possibility of, if you will, nuclear proliferation in the region. South Korea, Japan, others selling nuclear material, fissile material, the terrorist organization. Is that in the interest of China and Russia? Should we be doing more with China and Russia to get them on board with North Korea, as we did in the 6-party talks?
Well, I'm no Russian expert. That's obviously Dr. Mansurov. But I would think there might be an opportunity to do some of that with Russia if President Trump is able to get a peaceful end to what's going on in Ukraine right now. After that happens, that might be an opportunity to deal with Russia. With China, and the trade war that we're already in, I would call it a trade war already. It seems to me that we're already in a trade war. If we're able to calm that down and we're able to make them see things sensibly, I would say there might be an opportunity there, because the Chinese and the Russian governments obviously are all about the Chinese and the Russian governments. They're much more interested in looking out for, the very best, that neo-realist view, right? They're much more interested in looking out for their own government's interests than they are in being part of the international group of nations and the systems that it belongs to. Um, but if they see it in their interest, if we can make them see it in their interest to have a non-nuclear North Korea and to have a more peaceful region, in other words, not wars going on everywhere, um, that may happen. I don't know. As I said, the opportunity for the Russians, I would think, would be after, post Ukrainian peace agreement. If that happens, I would think for the Chinese, it depends a lot on how our trade goes. Maybe the Chinese will trade, will change. I don't know, and but that would be my opinion. As a guy who's a former military guy, that's where my expertise lies, not in diplomacy, but I would think that would make sense. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. It answers the question. And just one follow-up on that. Uh, if there's change in Iran, if the Ayatollah, because we've seen the Green Revolution and other moves and so forth, where there's unhappiness in Iran with the theocracy, etc. If there's change in Iran, is that in any way going to affect North Korea and their relationship with Iran and with Iran's proxies?
I would most certainly think so. If Iran was to have another revolution and they got real democracy and they had a more pro-Western government, I mean, you realize this, so does Sasha. Iranian people are very cosmopolitan. They know a lot about what goes on in the world around them. They're very intelligent. I would think they'd really be tired of this whole Ayatollah thing by now. A lot of them clearly are. If they get a government that, I mean, they don't have to get rid of, being deeply religious people. There's nothing wrong with that. But if they get a government that's more pro-Western, um, and is more willing to work with the West, even if it's for, purely economic reasons, that they know their oil is going to be better off going to the West and they can make more money off that, that would be a good thing. I think it's certainly a possibility. I've had many of my friends from that part of the world, largely Israelis, tell me that Iran is more ripe for a revolution than any other autocratic state on earth right now, largely for the reasons I just stated. So let's hope that happens. I'll keep my fingers crossed. Um, Certainly, the Iranian American friends that I know who live with my daughter, as I'm sure you guys know, my oldest daughter she's gone now, lived out in LA, and she lived in the Iranian conclave there.
Oh,
And they're really great people. So let's
no,
hope
I
that
agree.
happens.
I agree with you. The Iranian people are just, they are great people. And what a great civilization. Bruce and Sasha, but certainly Bruce, what a great discussion we've had this afternoon. And I think to our viewers, our listeners, I think there was so much to unpack in the things you shared with us. And we all look forward to reading your book that's coming out in May. I know it will have so much insight. And I want to thank you for spending the time with us today. I want to thank the Washington Times and President Chris Dolan, the Washington Times Foundation, and Dr. Michael Jenkins for permitting us to have these sessions the first Tuesday of every month. And I believe the next session we will have, if my calendar is correct, it's the 4th of March. So Bruce, we'll stay in touch. We'll read your book, and we thank you for sharing your insights today. Thank you,
Yes, sir.
Bruce.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.